Well, hello there, North Park Church family. This is not Pastor Luke Johnson. This is pastoral intern Luke Kjergaard, and I'm doing the first looks today because I have the sweet privilege of preaching on Sunday. I'm going to be preaching, as you can see here, the Lord's Prayer. I recently got an iPad. If you don't know, Pastor Luke and Pastor Zach both use iPads a lot. That's how Pastor Luke does these first looks. And kind of watching them use their iPads finally swayed me to go ahead and get one, and I think it'll be helpful in the future for seminary and other things like this. So Pastor Luke said, hey, now that you have an iPad, do you want to do a first looks episode for your sermon? And I was a little hesitant at first. I'm definitely not as proficient with my Apple Pencil as Pastor Luke or Pastor Zach, but I figured I can make do here. I can handle a little bit of highlighting and underlining. I will warn you, my wife often describes my handwriting as chicken scratch. So I'm going to try and make things legible here. So we are still in Matthew 6. If you didn't hear the message last week, I encourage you to go listen to it. Pastor Luke preached Matthew 6, 1 through 18, and skipped over this part since I was going to be preaching it this coming Sunday. So we're still here in Matthew chapter 6, and the Lord's Prayer is verses 9 through 13. We might mention something about verses 14 and 15 as well, because they are connected to this, but popularly known as the Lord's Prayer. But some people prefer, I think I prefer, the model prayer. And that's because this isn't a recorded prayer of Jesus. This is him teaching on prayer and giving this example, this model. So a title like the Lord's Prayer might be more fitting for what we see in like John 17 with the high priestly prayer, where it's actually Jesus praying, not teaching on prayer. So, but I might use both terms as we talk about this, but I think the preference is the model prayer. And so he's teaching on prayer. In the message last week, the verses prior to this, when Jesus is teaching on prayer, he's really mostly teaching what not to do. And then he starts talking about what to do in prayer, and the major part of that is this model prayer. So I think this is going to be my sermon title here, Pray Then Like This. And this is important, pray then like this. It doesn't say pray this, it says pray then like this. I think that's one of the problems that there is with the Lord's Prayer, is so many of us have become so accustomed to this. Really in church history, I mean, it's become a part of church liturgy and really something that's recited more than utilized as a guide for prayer. And it's kind of ironic because in the teaching earlier in chapter 6 that we looked at last week, Jesus is speaking against vain repetitions and kind of empty prayers. And so it's kind of sad that then he gives this example for prayer, and then the church has kind of turned it into a vain repetition. Not that there's anything wrong with reciting it, but I don't think that was his intention in giving us this. So that's kind of why we call it the model prayer. It's something to model our prayers after. So I think we'll go through here, make some initial observations, maybe look at some key words, and then consider a few questions. Point out a few questions that might come up looking at this that would be worth considering. So first of all, the first brief observation I have is this prayer is short. This is a short prayer. And prior to sharing this prayer, Jesus was talking about how it was wrong to have these long-winded, ornate prayers, and people were praying in that way as if that's what it took to be heard by God. And so it's really a freeing thing that Jesus then says, pray like this, and he gives us a very brief prayer. To just read this out loud, it's like less than 20 seconds. So that's worth noting. Another big thing that jumps out at me is these plural pronouns that are used. So, our Father in heaven. Then down in verse 11, give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we also have forgiven our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. So it's a little peculiar because before this, Jesus was talking some about private prayer rather than praying out in the public square like the Pharisees would do in order to be seen by others. Jesus says, no, instead go to a private place, go to your closet, go to a secluded place where it's just you and the Father, and you meet with him in secret. And that could be taken, as Pastor Luke was pointing out, he's talking about the heart posture with these three things, giving and praying and fasting. And so it could be that you're still in public and you're praying, but your heart is not in that place where you're doing it to be seen by others, but you're really it's just you and God, even if you may be not in private. But I think also it can be taken literally to go to a private place, and we see that in Jesus' own life, how he would often go to a desolate place to be alone with the Father. So we have that, and then we get to this prayer, and it's using all of these plural pronouns. So that's interesting. That's something to consider. Why did he deliver it in that way? Another big thing that jumps out is how focused, at least the first half of this, is on God. So we could highlight some more things here. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come. Your will be done. And this is worth noting because this is really the whole first half of the prayer is focused on God before it even gets to these personal petitions, we could call them. And there's something we can learn from that. I think we're often accustomed to beginning our prayer and kind of getting right down to business, right to the things that we want to ask of God. And Jesus teaches us here in this model prayer that we need to slow down when we start praying, remember who we're speaking to, and kind of recalibrate ourselves. We might have these things, these heavy petitions that we want to bring before God, but before we do that, we should recalibrate our priorities. Remember that what's really important is God's glory. And I think we'll find when we start in that way, even before we get to our actual petitions, we are encouraged, we've reminded ourselves of our sovereign Father, who is in control of all things, who can handle our problems. I think that's good to slow down and remind ourselves of that. And I think that's part of what Jesus is showing us here in this prayer. Outside of that, those initial observations, I found it helpful to kind of mark out where each of the petitions are. So traditionally, this is broken into 6 petitions. So, hallowed be your name is our first petition. Some people might lump these together, but traditionally it's going to be petitions 2 and 3. Then give us this day our daily bread is petition number 4. Forgive us our debts, petition number 5. And then some people might make 2 petitions out of this down here, but traditionally this is considered petition 6. That's just kind of helpful to take note of, especially if you're going to do some more reading on the Lord's Prayer. As people are writing about this, they're often going to be referring to things as petition number 1, petition number 2, and so on. So we take note of that. Let's see. Let's consider some words that would maybe be worth looking into a little more deeply. Really, there's a lot here we could look into more deeply, but just to pick a few, hallowed is not really a word we often use, but here it's kind of just this petition. Petition number 1 is asking that God's name would be kept holy. Kept holy. But it might be worth taking a look at what that word actually means. Another one we could look at, daily. The Greek word here that's translated daily in the ESV and a lot of translations, I guess is actually kind of debated. It's not a common word, at least in the biblical text, and so there's some different ideas of what that means, but so it might be interesting to do a word study on that. Debts, and we could say debtors. That's important here. We can pretty safely say this is talking about sin. And I think the old King James says trespasses, which actually in the ESV, when you get into verses 14 and 15, which is referring back to verse 12 here, I think it says trespasses. I maybe should have dropped that in here to mark up as well, but that's okay. And what else could we talk about? Temptation, maybe, and evil. Evil could be also translated as the evil one. Deliver us from the evil one. And actually, the 6th petition has had some interesting interpretations before. Some people think it has to do with the tribulation. And this petition is asking that God would save us, that we wouldn't be those that fall away in the tribulation. That's not what I think it's talking about. I think it's talking about sin and God protecting us. We'll talk more about that in a second. So actually right now we'll talk about that. I want to point out before we wrap up, this isn't going to be very long, a couple questions that might pop up as we're looking at the Lord's Prayer, things that we need to consider. So this might have you wondering, we just put, why pray this? Because we know that God does not lead us into temptation. So why would we pray for him to not lead us into temptation? And similarly, verse 12, there seems to be an implication here that our being forgiven is related to whether we are forgiving others. And that's what comes up in verses 14 and 15, which are really Jesus' only commentary on this prayer. It finishes out, and he comments back on verse 12, basically saying, If you forgive others, your Father will forgive you, and if you don't forgive others, your Father will not forgive you. So that then we're asking, does our forgiveness depend on our forgiving? And we know that's not the case because we're saved by grace alone. We don't really play any role in our being saved. It's all God's work. But just reading the words here, especially in verses 14 and 15, that's what it seems to be saying. So we need to grapple with that and try and figure out what that is meaning. Also, I meant to mention the verse 13 here is cut short in a lot of modern translations. The King James Version, or maybe just how you might have memorized it, has that sort of doxology at the end. The reason that's not here in the ESV and a lot of modern translations is that's not included in a lot of the earliest manuscripts that we have. So a lot of scholars think that it's just kind of a doxology that was tacked on there at some point. But it's okay to include that in praying this. There's nothing off doctrinally with that part, and it's a really fitting end. We'll talk about that a little bit on Sunday. It's a fitting end to the prayer to end in praise when we started with praise up here. Anyways, I forgot to mention that. There's a doxology. Maybe put a question mark there. Why don't we have that here? Maybe one more thing we'll say is verse 10, kind of like we did with verse 13. Why pray this? Why do we pray that God's kingdom come and his will be done? When we know, that's part of the reason we're praying to God in the first place, because we know him as sovereign, and we know that his kingdom has already come in part and will come in fullness one day. And we know that his will be done. We know that he's ultimately in control of all things. So why are we praying that his kingdom would come, that his will would be done? That's definitely something worth considering. So I don't want to do too much more here. It's starting to get messy. But yeah, we will look at this on Sunday, Lord willing. Please pray for me as I finish preparing for this and get ready to preach. And yeah, thanks for watching.